Baleares. Madagascar is a unique island country found in the Indian Ocean, about 400 kilometers off the eastern coast of Africa. In the Western world, this is not a country that gets a lot of attention. If they think of it at all, most people only consider it that place where lemurs live. And while that impression is not wrong, it barely scratches the surface. Madagascar is home to one of the most unusual collections of plants and animals on Earth, many of which are found nowhere else. Today we will explore Madagascar's biodiversity, how the island formed, which animals managed to reach it, the waves of extinctions following human arrival, and why so much of its biodiversity is found nowhere else on Earth. Madagascar is massive. It is hard to understand the size from a map alone, as it is dwarfed by mainland Africa nearby. Madagascar is the fourth largest island in the world, stretching about 1,600 kilometers from north to south. For comparison, this is roughly the distance of driving from Amsterdam to Rome, or from New York City to Jacksonville, Florida. And both of those journeys are on mainland continents. Madagascar is just an island. While the Malagasy people make up over 90% of the island's inhabitants, they are often subdivided into 18 ethnic groups. I was lucky enough to visit Madagascar a few years ago and picked up a few words of the language while I was there. In fact, if you do know the language, you can probably guess where in the country I was, just based on my greeting. Baleares means hello or good morning, but is most common among the northern Sakalava people, who live in the northwest part of the country. Google Translate, on the other hand, will tell you that hello is salama, which is the much more common greeting in the rest of the country. These cultural differences extend beyond just a language and into other aspects of Malagasy life. Whādi, often translated as taboos, are cultural prohibitions that are taken very seriously. Some are shared nationwide, but many will change between regions, towns, or even families. Pointing at graves, for example, is widely considered whādi. However, around the eastern city of Mananjari, twins have traditionally been considered whādi by the Antamboaka people, while elsewhere they are a cause for celebration. While abandoning or killing children is now illegal, these practices demonstrate how deeply rooted local whādi is in Malagasy culture. But Madagascar's biodiversity cannot be explained by culture alone. To understand how lemurs and countless other species evolved here, we need to travel much further back in time, to the breakup of a supercontinent. During the Jurassic period, around 170 million years ago, Madagascar was landlocked. It was in the middle of Gondwanaland, the supercontinent that contained land from modern-day South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. Despite its modern location near Africa, when Gondwanaland started to break apart around 130 million years ago, Madagascar remained attached to the Indian subcontinent. Africa and South America had broken off, drifting westward, while Australia and Antarctica moved south. Madagascar remained joined to India until about 88 million years ago. India, of course, would drift north to collide with the Eurasian continental plate, but from this point on, Madagascar was truly isolated from the rest of the world. For tens of millions of years, plants and animals on the island would evolve largely in isolation, producing one of the most distinctive ecosystems on Earth. This isolation explains why, despite its status as an African nation, Madagascar lacks most classic African animals. It has no apes, no lions, no giraffes. When biogeographers ask why a species lives somewhere, there are usually two possible explanations. Either its ancestors were already present before a landmass became isolated, or they arrived afterwards. These processes are known as vicariance and dispersal, respectively. Since Madagascar was most recently connected to India rather than Africa, any species present through vicariance should show closer relationships to Indian lineages than African ones. Surprisingly, many of Madagascar's most iconic animals do not, so they are more likely to have arrived through dispersal. Malagasy mammals, for example, have 4 known dispersal events from mainland Africa, all of which rafted across the Mozambique Channel to reach the island. Lemurs, around 60 to 50 million years ago, tenrecs, around 42 to 25 million years ago, carnivorans, around 26 to 19 million years ago, and rodents around 24 to 20 million years ago. Of course, lemurs were not intentionally crossing the ocean. In biogeography, rafting refers to the accidental, long-distance dispersal across water. This is usually believed to occur on vegetation mats, made of clumps of trees, soil, and plants, washed out to sea by a storm. But it can also occur by swimming, especially where island hopping is possible to reach a more distant landmass. Reaching Madagascar is one thing, but it still doesn't explain the modern-day diversity and uniqueness of the fauna and flora. Today, around 90% of all plants and animals in Madagascar are endemic, meaning they are found nowhere else in the world. Islands in general tend to show a high level of endemism, but even for an island, Madagascar has one of the highest rates of endemism in the world. Part of the reason certainly lies with the length of time it has been isolated. 88 million years is a long time, and even with the later dispersal of some groups, it is still more than enough time for them to massively diversify and evolve separately from their mainland relatives. But that is not the entire reason. New Zealand, for example, has been isolated for almost as long, around 85 million years, but only just over half of its species are endemic. Still a lot, but not the 90% figure seen in Madagascar. So, Madagascar's isolation alone does not explain its remarkable biodiversity. The island is also incredibly diverse geographically. Moist trade winds create rainforests along the eastern coast, while a rain shadow leaves much of the west completely dry. The central highlands dominate the middle of the island, a large continuous dry region consistently above 800 meters in altitude, a sharp contrast to the lowlands of the coastal regions. The south coast is a desert known as the spiny forest, a region with low rainfall and poor soil. 95% of the plants in the spiny forest are endemic to this region in particular, as they need to have extreme adaptations to thrive in the perpetual drought. Even just these broad regions give an indication to the variety across Madagascar, but among those are smaller, more specialized environments. The island also has notable stretches of mangroves, cloud forests, and alpine tundra. And then there are the Singi. Singi are areas of sharpened limestone pinnacles, and are an unusual geological formation only found in Madagascar. There are two main areas where Singi are found: Ankarana Special Reserve in the far north, and Singi di Bimaraha National Park in the west. Singi literally means walking on tiptoes, or where one cannot walk barefoot. Sometimes known as stone forests, they are areas of deep fissures, extensive cave systems, and rocky ground. It is yet another type of habitat where certain animals have adapted to live in this harsh, unforgiving environment. For example, the ant Singi leaf chameleon is an endangered dwarf chameleon covered in thorny spines only found here. Or the Singi tufted tail rat, which have specialized feet to help them climb the jagged cliffs in the Singi. These environments create a diverse mosaic of landscapes across the country. Although technically an island, Madagascar contains such diversity of climates and habitats that it functions almost like a miniature continent. This very geography is important to understand the diversity of fauna and flora in Madagascar. Over millions of years, these landscapes allowed species to evolve to specialize in these different habitats. A small number of colonizing lineages diversified into hundreds of unique species, filling ecological roles occupied elsewhere by completely different groups of animals. The result was one of the strangest ecosystems on Earth. Before humans ever reached Madagascar, the island was even more unusual than it is today. Ecosystems that now seem quiet were once home to giant animals, many unlike anything alive in the modern world. This was not just an island of lemurs, but a landscape dominated by megafauna, enormous birds, massive primates, and reptiles that filled roles taken elsewhere by completely different groups. Among the most striking were the elephant birds. These were perhaps the largest bird to have ever lived, reaching up to 3 meters or 10 feet tall. Surprisingly, their closest living relatives are not ostriches, but actually kiwi, a relationship that hints at an ancient Gondwanaland origin. Like their modern relatives, elephant birds were flightless. The largest species likely grazed in open grasslands, while smaller species browsed in the forests. In a land without cattle, horses, or antelopes, animals like the elephant birds filled the role of large terrestrial herbivores. But birds were not the only grazers in Madagascar. The island was also home to several species of pygmy hippopotamus. These were not the same as the modern pygmy hippo of West Africa, but were unique species found only in Madagascar. They were the only ungulates ever native to Madagascar, although it is unknown how they managed to reach the island. At least 3 species are known, and some appear to have been far less aquatic than modern hippos, with longer limbs and a greater ability to run on land. Other herbivores played quieter but equally important roles. Giant tortoises were widespread and likely among the most influential grazers and seed dispersers in the ecosystem. Their presence is not surprising. Giant tortoises still live on nearby islands like Aldabra in the Seychelles. In fact, modern conservationists are actively studying whether Aldabra tortoises could help restore lost ecological functions in Madagascar, such as controlling vegetation and reducing wildfires. Not all of Madagascar's strange megafauna were large and slow-moving herbivores. One of the more unusual animals was the so-called Malagasy aardvark. Despite the name, it was not an aardvark at all, but was more closely related to tenrecs. With strong limbs adapted for digging, it likely fed on termites and ants, and may also have been capable of climbing trees. Madagascar is best known today for its lemurs, but modern species tend to be relatively small. In the past, this was not the case. Some lemurs reached truly extraordinary sizes. Archaeoindus was the largest lemur ever known, reaching the size and weight of a male gorilla. It likely lived in a mix of woodlands and more open habitats, feeding mainly on leaves, and may have been a slow climber that also used the ground to move between trees. Archaeoindus was not alone. Koala lemurs in the genus Megaladapus were specialized browsers with robust skulls and powerful jaws, while the monkey lemurs of Archaeolema appear to have been more terrestrial and opportunistic. Even familiar modern lemurs once had much larger relatives. The giant ii, the only known relative of today's ii, likely shared its distinctive feeding strategy of extracting insects from wood, but was at least twice as large. This pattern of gigantism was not restricted to herbivores. The fossa, Madagascar's largest living mammalian predator, once had a larger giant relative. The giant fossa has been described as a formidable puma-like carnivore, and likely preyed on the giant lemurs as well as smaller animals. It is notable as the only known extinct carnivoran mammal from Madagascar. The waterways had their own apex predator as well. Madagascar was once home to a distinct species of crocodile, Voie robustus, recognizable by a pair of bony horns on its skull. Reaching lengths of around 4 meters or 13 feet, it was likely the largest predator on the island in recent times. Above it all, hunted the Malagasy crowned eagle. Endemic to Madagascar, this massive bird of prey weighed around 7 kilograms or 15 pounds, similar in size to a large golden eagle. It likely specialized in hunting lemurs, and may help explain behaviors still seen today. Many modern lemurs show strong avoidance responses to aerial predators, even though no living raptor on the island is large enough to regularly attack adult lemurs. These behaviors may be echoes of a time when the crowned eagle ruled Madagascar's skies. This was the world in which the first humans arrived. Exactly when people first reached Madagascar remains uncertain, but archaeological evidence suggests the island was at least visited by humans around 4,000 years ago. The earliest unambiguous evidence of a permanent human population was 490 CE, roughly 1500 years ago. For context, that is around the same time as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, making the settlement of Madagascar remarkably recent in the grand scheme of both human and evolutionary history. Most of these early settlers were Austronesian, part of the cultural group that spread from Southeast Asia across the Pacific. Several hundred years later, Bantu peoples from mainland Africa also began arriving on the island. These two groups intermingled, forming the ancestors of the modern Malagasy people, a unique blend of Polynesian and African ancestry found nowhere else in the world. Over the centuries that followed, Madagascar became increasingly connected to trade networks stretching across the Indian Ocean, and was later drawn into European colonial expansion. These connections would eventually reshape much of the island's landscape, but long before that, the arrival of humans had already begun to change Madagascar's ecosystems. While humans explored and settled the island, the animals of Madagascar were not thriving. Instead, there were waves of extinctions, and their timing is revealing. The first wave occurred around 1500 to 2000 years ago, closely matching the earliest evidence for permanent human settlement. The initial casualties were some of the island's most vulnerable species. The Malagasy aardvark vanished early, between around 200 BCE to 100 CE. Its disappearance was likely driven by the earliest forest clearing, which not only destroyed its habitat, but also disrupted the ants and termites it depended on for food. Around the same time, Madagascar lost one of its most extraordinary animals. Archaeoindris, the gorilla-sized lemur, disappeared soon after humans became established on the island. As a very large mammal, Archaeoindris likely had a slow reproductive rate. This meant that even relatively low levels of hunting pressure could have been devastating. Combined with habitat loss from slash-and-burn agriculture, its populations were probably unable to recover, leading to a rapid collapse. These early extinctions were a warning of what was to come. The second wave followed several centuries later, between roughly 1300 and 1000 years ago. By this point, humans had been present on Madagascar for generations, and the impacts of hunting and habitat fragmentation were beginning to accumulate across the landscape. One of the casualties of this period was Madagascar's endemic crocodile, Voie robustus. Its extinction was likely not caused by humans alone, as wetlands and rivers were altered by settlement and agriculture, and as climatic conditions shifted. Crocodile populations became increasingly stressed. Into this environment arrived a new competitor, the Nile crocodile. By around 1300 to 1400 years ago, Voie robustus had disappeared entirely. Habitat fragmentation also placed increasing pressure on the monkey lemurs. These animals were initially able to cope with the changing environment. Their flexible diet allowed them to exploit harder seeds and more open savanna-like habitats as forests shrank. But this adaptability had limits. As human expansion continued, their populations became increasingly fragmented, until they eventually collapsed entirely around 1000 years ago. The fate of predators was closely tied to the fate of their prey. With Archaeoindris long gone, and other large lemurs such as the monkey lemurs disappearing, the giant fossa soon followed. This extinction was no coincidence. Both the giant fossa and the Voie crocodile, Madagascar's two largest apex predators, vanished during the same period. In addition to prey loss, both were aggressively hunted and persecuted by humans due to the threat they posed to safety and livelihoods. The third and final wave of extinctions occurred between about 1000 to 500 years ago. By this point, Madagascar's fauna had reached a tipping point. Species that had previously survived by adapting to altered habitats or retreating into refuges found that there was nowhere left to hide. Some of the island's most iconic animals disappeared during this final collapse. Elephant birds went extinct around 1000 years ago. Their survival for so long is surprising, given their enormous size, and it may be that adult birds were simply too dangerous or difficult to hunt. But humans did not need to kill the adults to drive them extinct. The systematic harvesting of elephant bird eggs would have prevented populations from being replenished. The Malagasy crowned eagle vanished around the same time. This enormous bird of prey relied heavily on lemurs for food, and once the giant lemurs were gone, it likely starved into extinction. It still has a living close relative, the African crowned eagle, that hunts monkeys and antelopes in sub-Saharan Africa. But Madagascar had lost their mammals of a similar size. The pygmy hippos were also lost during this period. Initially, they had found refuge in rivers and wetlands, but over time, those habitats were drained or degraded, while competition with domestic cattle for grazing intensified. Combined with sustained hunting pressure, these factors drove the pygmy hippos to extinction. The last giant lemurs followed soon after. The giant ii disappeared less than 1000 years ago. Continued deforestation destroyed its mature forest habitat, and it may have also faced direct persecution. Today, the modern ii is widely considered whare, often seen as a harbinger of death, and it is still sometimes killed as a result. It is entirely possible that its much larger extinct relative faced similar prejudices. The koala lemurs lasted a little longer, but eventually succumbed to the same pressures. They had persisted in remnant patches of dense canopy forest, but ongoing deforestation and targeted hunting eliminated their final populations around 500 years ago. Following the timeline of extinctions, we can see the real impacts of human arrival on the island. From first human settlement, when the most vulnerable species disappeared, to around 500 years ago, the combined pressures of habitat loss, fragmentation, hunting, competition with introduced livestock, and shifting ecosystems reshaped the fauna of Madagascar into what we see today. Of course, extinction did not stop 500 years ago. The Aliotra grebe, a small diving bird last seen in 1985 and officially declared extinct in 2010, is a recent reminder of that ongoing process. And many of Madagascar's surviving species remain under threat. But it is the concentration of so many losses into such a short period of time that makes the megafaunal extinctions so noticeable. Despite the waves of extinctions that followed human arrival, there is one group of organisms that has, in many ways, bridged the gap between pre-human and modern Madagascar. It's plants. While deforestation and habitat fragmentation have dramatically reduced forest cover, many of Madagascar's most iconic plant lineages have persisted from deep in the island's past. Perhaps the most recognizable of these are the baobabs. In the genus Adansonia, baobabs are thought to have originated in Madagascar. Even today, 6 of the world's 8 species are found only on the island, with the remaining 2 occurring in mainland Africa and Australia. Baobabs are massive trees that tower over the landscape, instantly recognizable by their enormous trunks and large berry-like fruit protected by a hard outer shell. One of Madagascar's most famous landmarks, the Alley of the Baobabs, is an unpaved road in the west of the country, lined with dozens of Grenadier's baobabs. Another of Madagascar's most distinctive plants is the traveller's palm, Ravenala madagascariensis. The name comes from the water stored at the base of its leaf stems, which can provide drinking water to travellers, and from the way its fan-shaped leaves tend to orient from west to east, allowing it to act as a crude compass. Although not a true palm, it is a massive plant, the largest individuals reaching around 30 metres or 100 feet tall, with individual leaves up to 11 metres or 36 feet long. In modern Madagascar, the traveller's palm is an important cultural resource, providing all the materials needed to build a house: the trunk for flooring, leaf stalks for walls, and leaves for roof thatching. These are just 2 of Madagascar's most iconic plants. In total, the island is home to 5 plant families found nowhere else on Earth, more than 900 species of orchids, around 200 species of palms, and countless other endemic plants. In many ways, Madagascar's plant diversity rivals and may even exceed that of its animals, standing as a living connection between the island's ancient ecosystems and the landscapes that remain today. One of the most influential plants in modern Madagascar, however, is not native at all. Vanilla was introduced by humans, but today Madagascar produces over 60% of the world's supply. The crop is often grown in shaded agroforestry systems, making it economically vital while still closely tied to the survival of forest habitats, illustrating how deeply modern livelihoods are now intertwined with the island's remaining biodiversity. Baobabs and traveller's palms still dominate the skyline, but the animals that live amongst them have changed. Madagascar today is not the same world that existed before humans arrived. It is a reduced and reshaped ecosystem, one that has lost many of its largest inhabitants, yet still retains an extraordinary level of biological uniqueness. The most recognizable survivors are the lemurs. Despite the loss of their giant relatives, Madagascar remains the only place on Earth where lemurs live in the wild. Today, more than 100 species are recognized, ranging from tiny mouse lemurs weighing just a few dozen grams to the Indri, the largest living lemur whose haunting calls echo through the remaining forests. Together, they fill ecological roles that elsewhere are occupied by monkeys, apes, and other browsing animals. Among them is one of the strangest primates alive today, the aye-aye. The aye-aye is the only surviving member of its family, and it uses a foraging strategy not found in other primates. It uses a technique similar to echolocation, locating food by sound. By tapping on tree bark and listening for changes in resonance, it can detect hollow chambers beneath the surface, allowing it to locate hidden insect larvae. This reliance on sound to find prey is unique among primates, and is paired with its elongated fingers, used to extract the larvae it discovers. Madagascar's predators are just as distinctive. The island's mammalian carnivores form a single endemic radiation, the family Eupleridae, or the Malagasy carnivorans. Descended from a single African ancestor, they diversified to fill roles occupied elsewhere by cats, civets, and mongooses. The fossa is the largest of these and the island's top mammalian predator, but it is joined by smaller relatives such as the Phaneroca and Voncera, all found nowhere else on Earth. Eupleridae and the lemurs are not even the only endemic Malagasy mammalian families. Tenrecs are small insect-eating mammals related to elephants and aardvarks, and are found only in Madagascar. They have diversified into forms that resemble shrews, hedgehogs, and even otters. Once accompanied by much larger relatives, they now persist as some of the island's most diverse mammals. Reptiles and amphibians are where Madagascar's endemism becomes even more striking. Nearly all of the island's over 300 frog species are endemic, and many are restricted to single regions or even single forests. Madagascar is also famous for its chameleons, including some of the largest species in the world and the smallest reptiles ever discovered. Entire genera of snakes and lizards are found only on the island, reflecting millions of years of isolation and independent evolution. What remains today is an ecosystem shaped as much by absence as by presence. Large seed dispersers are gone, apex predators are fewer, forests are fragmented, and yet, despite this, Madagascar still holds an extraordinary concentration of life found nowhere else on Earth. Modern Madagascar is not a relic of the past. It is a living, evolving system under pressure. What survives today represents only a fraction of what once existed, but it is also a reminder of how much is still at stake. What we have explored here is only a small fraction of Madagascar's biodiversity, past and present. We have focused on the animals most closely tied to the island's megafaunal extinctions and the ecosystems they once shaped. Entire worlds remain unexplored in this story. The island's vast diversity of fungi, freshwater fish, insects, and other invertebrates, as well as countless plants and smaller vertebrates, many of which are just as endemic and just as vulnerable. Madagascar's biodiversity cannot be fully captured in a 30-minute video. What we have seen here is only a representative glimpse of a much larger and more complex living system. Madagascar's biodiversity today is extraordinary, but it is also fragile. The same processes that drove the extinction of the island's megafauna have not stopped. They have simply changed form. Deforestation remains the single greatest threat to Madagascar's wildlife. Large areas of forest have been cleared for agriculture, fuel, and settlement, fragmenting habitats that many endemic species depend on. For animals restricted to small ranges, a single forest, mountain, or waterway, even minor habitat loss can be catastrophic. What were once continuous ecosystems have become isolated fragments, cutting off populations and reducing their long-term viability. This pressure is especially severe for species that depend on intact forest structure. Lemurs that require large home ranges, chameleons specialized to dense canopy, and frogs adapted to humid forest floors all struggle to persist in a landscape increasingly broken apart. Many species survive today only in small pockets of remaining habitat, their populations a fraction of what they once were. And yet, conservation in Madagascar is not a story of loss alone. Large areas of the island are now protected through national parks, reserves, and community-managed forests. These areas safeguard not just individual species, but entire ecosystems, places where evolutionary processes can still continue. In some regions, conservation efforts have slowed deforestation, stabilized populations, and even allowed certain species to recover. Crucially, many of these efforts now recognize that Madagascar's biodiversity cannot be protected without also supporting the people who live alongside it. Community-based conservation projects, sustainable agriculture, and agroforestry systems aim to balance livelihoods with forest protection. Crops such as vanilla, grown under shaded forest canopies, highlight both the opportunities and challenges of linking global markets to local conservation. The stakes could not be higher. Madagascar has already lost much of its unique natural heritage, but what remains is irreplaceable. Entire lineages, millions of years of independent evolution, exist nowhere else on Earth. If they disappear here, they disappear forever. Madagascar's story is often told as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly isolated ecosystems can unravel. but it is more a story continuing to unfold. The forests that remain, the species that survive, and the conservation efforts now underway represent a chance, not to restore the past, but to preserve what is left for the future. I hope you enjoyed this journey to Madagascar. If you're interested in the research behind this episode, you can find a document with image credits and sources in the description below. These videos take a great deal of time and research to produce. They will always remain free to watch. But if you would like to support the channel and gain access to new videos a little earlier, you can find a link to my Patreon below as well. And to everyone who already supports the channel, thank you. Your support genuinely helps make these videos possible. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and keep learning. There's still so much to discover about the world's rare and remarkable species. And the more we understand, the better our chances of protecting them. Thanks for watching.